And so we've arrived. The following serial killers have amassed a body count of at least 60 confirmed murders and more. These are effectively the worst serial killers of the 20th and 21st centuries. Let's finish the project. Samuel Little. Little is the last entry from the United States of America, because this individual is the most prolific serial killer in the history of the USA. I remember when I was in my 20s and Ridgway was still the most prolific, and it was a shock to find out his record was broken. With 60 confirmed murders and maybe up to 100 over a lengthy period of 35 years, let's hope the new record won't be broken. Little's mother was a prostitute, his father unknown, he had behaviour problems early on, he had violent fantasies when he was a child, and juvenile delinquency soon became a lot worse. It seems like Little was arrested for everything they had: drunk driving, theft, fraud, rape, burglary, assault, and the list goes on. He was suspected of murder in the early 80s but was acquitted, and was arrested for kidnapping on top of everything else. He moved around the States a lot, often staying in homeless shelters and getting involved with drugs. In 2012 he was arrested again for Lord only knows how many times, and DNA finally caught him. Little was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in 2014. He was connected to multiple murders over the years, and soon he started confessing to other murders, including one for which the wrong man was convicted. Little was a strangler, like so many others before him, and he targeted the less dead, that is, women that lived high-risk lives and were vulnerable to people like him. In fact, many of the murders were ruled as accidents or overdoses. The vast majority were black, but some were white. There are several acts of necrophilia. When doing an interview where Little comes off like a gentle old man reminiscing about old girlfriends, he said his victims were like grapes on the vine. And this has really stayed with me. I think that's how psychopaths incorrectly view us. Just so many grapes on the vine.
Grabbed by the legs and pulled her to the water. That's the only one that I ever killed by drowning.
Xinhai, aka the Monster Killer. Our first entry in the bottom 10 proper. So many meaningless adjectives, I can't write them anymore. In fact, I never really could. I can only make references in vague and weird ways. If a bathtub holds 34 pints, 67 victims would be nearly 2 bathtubs full of blood. I again think of hurricanes. Category 5 Atlantic Hurricane Andrew of 1992 killed 65 people, and wasn't as deadly as Xinhai, China's most prolific serial killer. Growing up impoverished but said to be intelligent, he'd been arrested for theft and later rape prior to his many murders, and his crimes include breaking and entering then killing the whole family, mostly farmers and peasants, usually by bludgeoning and sometimes with an axe. He killed children, raped women, robbed houses, and left behind him devastation. He raped a pregnant woman and would beat people into disability. He was caught by chance, convicted by DNA, and later executed. Kampatimar Shankaria. Out of nowhere, we are presented with India's most prolific recent serial killer. In my search, I found many strange and frightening serial killers from this nation, and I should like to study them deeper at a later date, but I hope the details are more forthcoming than this. I don't have a single tag for one of the worst serial killers the world has ever seen. Not one. Only a petty paragraph of basic information from Wikipedia and Murderpedia alike, and a few short videos that just repeat that information. I don't think Kampatimar was even his name, just a moniker given to him that means one who hits under ear. It said he killed 70 people in 2 years, and this makes him the deadliest and bloodiest in the shortest period of time. the ever-discussed kills-to-time ratio. He killed by bludgeoning with a hammer, supposedly for the thrill/joy of it, and was executed a year later, aged 27. Pedro Rodriguez Filho, aka Killer Petey. Our second entry from Brazil, and the second vigilante who amassed a kill count higher than some of the most notorious serial killers from all over the world. But Filho was no cop. It's curious, he's like a criminal version of Oliveira, but he targeted other criminals. He even killed an entire gang for the murder of his pregnant girlfriend. Pedro Filho has been called the IRL Punisher or Dexter. I've not seen either of those, so I can't say. Pedro started killing from as young as 14 years old, and claims to have killed over 100, but 71 seems to be the agreed-upon figure, with maybe 47 of those being rapists and other criminals he killed while in prison. I don't understand what condition Brazilian prisons are in. In fact, I know very little about the country, let alone one particular citizen. His relationship with his father was unusual. He seemed to defend his father when he was fired from his job. Filho responded by shooting the deputy mayor and someone else who may have been the reason his dad lost his job. But Filho wound up murdering his father in prison because his father killed his mother. It's very likely Pedro was beaten as a child, but one often repeated bit of trivia is Pedro was born with a bruised skull as a result of his father kicking his mother while she was pregnant. This might just be the only case of in utero head trauma in true crime. It feels like a villainous start of darkness, or the birth of an anti-hero depending on your point of view. Indeed, Filho is something of a divisive figure. I've refrained from judging killers that are unambiguously evil in the peacetime developed world, so I can be impartial to Filho as well. It's just hard sorting fact from fiction. He may have nearly killed his own cousin when he was a teenager, and that said girlfriend may have been a drug kingpin who was at least a decade older than him. Pedro very likely killed innocent people. Some of those in prison didn't even go to trial, and when he killed his father, he supposedly cut out his heart and took a bite from it. In spite of all that, the most outrageous thing about him is he's been released and has his own YouTube channel. I don't know anything about this channel, and apparently it's all in Portuguese. To his credit, he speaks out against vigilantism and says criminal activities are nothing to be proud of. I certainly don't think all of his victims deserved it from the point of view of even those who admire him, but I know I'm not the first one to be left baffled by this case.
Porque a gente quando vai guerrear com inimigos, você não pode com dois.
Daniel Camargo Barbosa, aka the Sadist of El Charquito. Onto a much less ambiguous individual from Colombia. Barbosa killed between 72 to 180 young girls in the 70s and 80s. His background saw his mother die when he was very young, and his stepmother was abusive. She forced him to dress like a girl and go to school like that. All sources report his IQ to be above average, but I feel we're all just repeating the same source, which may or may not be correct. In adulthood, Barbosa had a fixation on virginity, but his fiancée wasn't a virgin. She wound up placating him by bringing young girls back to their house for him to rape. I don't know the age of the victims, but I do know the last one reported him to the police, and both Barbosa and his fiancée went to prison. After perhaps a decade in prison, Barbosa henceforth decided not to leave any witnesses. In Brazil, he kidnapped, raped and killed a 9-year-old girl. He was arrested after an unknown number of similar murders and rapes, but he actually escaped from prison on a makeshift raft. Arriving in Ecuador, he continued his paedophilic spree, killing over 50 girls and living on the streets. He was caught a few years later and gave a false name, but was later identified by a rape victim who must have survived her assault. Barbosa led authorities to many dead children, and like so many others displayed no remorse for his crimes. He mutilated the bodies and said he preferred virgins because they cried. He was convicted in 1989 but only got 16 years in prison. I've no idea why the country works this way, but he was murdered in prison by someone who was reportedly a nephew of one of his victims. This suggests at least some of his victims were old enough to have siblings with children of their own. To further muddy this case, sometimes his nickname is the Sadist of Charquito, but I can't be sure.
Mi vida desde pequeño, es decir, una cuestión que ustedes pudieran entregar al público.
Mikhail Popkov, aka the Werewolf. Back to Russia for their most prolific modern serial killer. Popkov killed between 78 to 83 women all over Russia from 1992 to 2010. Originally convicted for 22 murders thanks to DNA, he soon confessed to the rest. Popkov has killed more people than Hurricane Michael of 2018, which killed 74 people. We don't know much about Popkov's childhood, but it seems likely his mother was an abusive alcoholic. We do know he used to work as a police officer and was married with a daughter. His own victims were aged 16 to 40 he'd pick up, and he raped them and mutilated their bodies extensively and brutally, thus giving him that nickname. I hope it was after death, but maybe it wasn't. He also raped the corpses. There was one instance where, against all odds, one victim survived and identified him, but Mikhail's wife, also a police officer, gave him a false alibi. So much was she convinced her husband couldn't possibly be the monstrous killer. We can't judge too harshly. It's been proved many a time now that these people are truly gifted manipulators and liars. There was one story where one of his victims revived herself in the morgue, which itself brings up so many questions to this case. Popkov changed his murder methods, likely as a means to confuse police, but the incompetence of law enforcement for this one is one of the worst than anything I've seen prior. I think they knew what Popkov was up to but covered up for him to help purge the streets of immoral women. As a child, Popkov saw his mother having sex with another man whilst his own father looked on, and Popkov got cheated on twice by romantic partners. This might explain his hatred of women. He even burned the bodies of his victims a few times, and there was another strange incident. After killing 2 women, he realised he'd left his police badge at the crime scene and had to go back. When he went back, he found one of his victims actually hadn't died and would have been able to identify him. He killed her. This is incredible, and combined with the false alibi, I can only call it grace of the devil.
Вот если я скажу просто, у меня есть так желание, это не совсем искренне будет, потому что все-таки это не как...
Niels Hogel. Bottom 5. Let's get this over with. I've another hurricane comparison, and it's Hurricane Dorian of 2019 that killed 84, but perhaps killed 245 others who went missing. It's the worst natural disaster in the Bahamas' history, and it's second to the next killer. Hogel, a former nurse, is very likely the most prolific German serial killer. His father and grandmother were nurses also, and there's nothing obvious in his trauma history. But for perhaps 6 years he killed at least 85 people. But it's possible he claimed 300 lives over a 15-year period. Many of his victims were the elderly, but some were as young as 34, and the case is still ongoing. Hogel was married with a child, and outside of work no one knew anything was wrong. It seems his motivation wasn't so much to be an angel of death and to have control over life like other medical quacks, but he wanted to save the victim and look like a hero. He'd put his victims in a life-threatening situation and then tried to save them, and often failed. He'd inject unauthorized chemicals into his victims to send them to the brink of death in order to be resuscitated. If he succeeded in saving their life, he'd be seen as a hero by his colleagues and the victim. he was caught by long-time suspicious colleagues. Javid, Iqbal and accomplices, aka Kukri. In the last 4, we've reached the killers who very likely took over 100 victims. I'm increasing the prolific rating for the final 4, and Javid Iqbal did it over a period of 2 years. 50 kills a year for 2 years. This beats out Shankaria for the bloodiest kill to year ratio, and I don't think it will be beaten. It's absolutely incredible. It may even be less than 2 years. It's all the worse when you remember the victims were children, boys aged between 6 to 16, and however many of them were sexually assaulted. Iqbal would then dissolve the bodies in acid a la John Haig, and continue a killing reign I can only compare to a job. It's more comparable to the slaughters by Giles de Reyes or Elizabeth Bathory, but this happened in the late 90s. Pakistan is a very long way away, and I don't know much about the nation, let alone its types of crimes. But people like this are international in their evil, and so, like with Chinese and South American serial killers, I analyse him by the same criterion, and that analysis is very bleak. There doesn't seem to be any obvious trauma history at all. In fact, he came from a rather affluent and privileged background, with wealthy parents who provided. So why? He confessed out of the blue, before being arrested, which doesn't happen very often. It didn't take long to corroborate his confession. He kept a record of each kill, labels, photographs, pamphlets, and all the evidence that was needed. He had opened an arcade to lure in the children, and after a ruse, he'd rape and strangle them. This is how many victims met their end. Supposedly he was going to kill himself after this confession, but that didn't happen. Everything about this case suggests it was done for a specific reason. 100 was a target, not a coincidence, and of all people, I know that. The motive was to attack the police force because he felt wronged for being arrested for sodomizing a young boy in the 90s. I don't think Iqbal did any real prison time for this crime, but his mother endured the shame of it and died of a heart attack. There may have been a longer list of pederast transgressions, but I can't verify them. Iqbal blames the police and decided to humiliate them by highlighting their incompetence. If there really was no task force or even a case investigating the disappearance of 100 boys, I'd say the entire crime spree really was a very brutal means of taunting the police. Did parents not report their sons missing out of fear? But it seems Javid targeted homeless runaways unlikely to be missed, so this is a moot point. But 100? This act of blaming others for the results of your crime reminds me of Moses Sittol. But in court, Iqbal claims the whole thing was a hoax, which is an unusual thing to claim when piles of clothes, 100 photographs, and vats of acid have been found in your home. Javid must have known this and was presumably seeking to make a farce of the legal process, as well as law enforcement. He said it was all to draw attention to the poor children of Pakistan. All I can think is that this has brought a whole new meaning to the term homicidal protest. So far, the motives are all over the place. He said he'd commit suicide in the letter, but he turned himself into the newspapers to avoid being killed. Regardless, he was found guilty and sentenced to be cut into 100 pieces and thrown into a vat of acid. This was later changed. His accomplices were also caught. One was either thrown or jumped from a window, the others were either sentenced to death or as teenagers given whole life sentences. A few years after Iqbal's arrest, he was found hung in his cell, apparently by suicide, but we don't know for sure, and some sources said it was poisoning, not hanging. There's a film about him released only last year or so. It's since been banned, but it would be a godsend to see a subtitled version of it. Pedro Lopez, aka the Monster of the Andes. Hurricanes, hurricanes, hurricanes. Hurricane Hugo of 1989 killed 107 people. As terrible as it was, a natural disaster is indiscriminate. It doesn't exclusively target little girls. Comparing these killers to disasters is a poor analogy, though I should think they are just as unfeeling. Lopez killed at least 110 young women and is suspected of killing perhaps 300 over the 1980s. His early life was troubled. He witnessed his mother working as a prostitute, he molested his own sister, and was then kicked out of his home. There's no talk of the father, and I get the impression Lopez was an illicit liaison. He was enrolled in an orphanage and was reportedly molested himself by at least 2 other men, one a stranger and one a teacher. Years later he'd be arrested for auto theft and said he was gang raped in prison. Supposedly he later killed all of his attackers and upon release started murdering and raping little girls. One reason why is that in hating his mother as a prostitute, Lopez wanted to spoil clean virgin girls. He'd lost his innocence, so he'd take theirs. Other details are unreliable. Lopez allegedly sat on the mass graves of his victims and held tea parties and told them stories. Other sources say he only killed during the day so he could see the life going out of his victims' eyes. Lopez even knew Daniel Barbosa in prison, but I don't know any further details. It's clear they had slightly different motives for doing similar crimes, but I don't really know. Supposedly Lopez's mother was a real tyrant, and his father had actually been killed in the civil war of the time. What is known is that after serving 19 years for what can only be called a crime against humanity, he was declared sane and released. Those of us who decried Killer Petey would have to admit, better a vigilante murders a monster than the monster walks free. The line is drawn before 100 dead children. As of 2002, Lopez is wanted in connection with a fresh murder by Interpol, but his whereabouts are unknown.
Yo no cometía, yo estoy implicado como cómplice, claro que participé en el hecho, pero...
Luis Garavito, aka La Bestia, the Beast. As Pedro Lopez was to girls of the 80s, Garavito was to boys of the 90s. However, I don't have a good number for exactly how many. I know that's true for most killers, but estimates fluctuate wildly. I know Garavito was convicted of 142 counts of murder, but I'm sure when I made this list, maybe a year ago, Garavito's count was only 138. His nickname is indicative, and there's none more deserving. Reading his history, there is evidence of child killing, child molestation, necrophilia, torture, mutilation, and on it goes. And the upper estimate for him is perhaps 300 victims, mostly in Colombia, as well as Ecuador and Venezuela. Father, a drunk tyrant. Mother, also a tyrant and possibly a prostitute, but maybe not drunken. Like Chicatillo, Luis Garavito's early years are marred by war, in his case the Colombian conflict, which started in 1964 and is still ongoing. The boy was also beaten, likely sexually molested, and bullied by his classmates, to which teachers didn't seem to care. The molestation carried over into torture, including candles and razor blades as a child, making this an extreme trauma history. He killed and dissected 2 small birds, and as he grew he molested his younger siblings. The ongoing list includes possible impotency, even more instances of being raped and beaten, ballooning alcoholism, and on and off homelessness. As adulthood came, some said that despite everything, Garavito was quite an amicable sort. I'm inclined to believe the accusations of domestic abuse. Garavito's mind was ruined forever. Psychotic, depressed, paranoid, alcoholic, bulimic, and then he tried to kill himself. Before and after his suicide attempt, he really did try to get help, but the escalation process roared into being. He did to other children what was done to him, even carrying his own torture bag with candles and razor blades. It seems his psychosis rolled on and on with self-mutilation and beatings, a fascination with the Third Reich, commenting that he liked the concentration camps, and an interest in the occult and Satanism. I can't believe I've gone through 98 serial killer cases and only now is the devil being invoked. Later research states the authorities found satanic symbols in Berkowitz's apartment, but that's all. As the 90s continue, it isn't known how many children Garavito molested, but in 1992, after believing he'd spoken with the devil, he took his first life. He donned disguises, kept a record of his kills, and took trophies from the victims, at one point collecting the toes. I assumed the disguises were throwaway detail, but he really did become a master of disguise as the years went on. Curiously, there's been several instances of Garavito displaying guilt and remorse, but he didn't slow down. He killed perhaps 8 children in southeast Bogota in a short period of time. He also killed some adults, as they were witnesses to his many, many crimes. And still he wrestled with God over what he was doing and asked forgiveness. Some of his victims survived. One escaped when Garavito had passed out drunk after molesting and torturing the 9-year-old boy for 12 hours. Another boy, 10 years old, terrified by his ordeal, told Garavito that he liked being raped by him, and Lewis spared his life. Other victims became blood sacrifices to the devil. He'd stab them hundreds of times, flay the skin on their bottoms, violate them with objects, knocked out their teeth, burned them, stomped on them, cut off their genitals and stuffed them into their mouths. The torture was extensive and prolonged. The investigation was not very good. The Civil War helped Garavito move about easily, but the authorities did find the mass graves of his victims, and they couldn't have known it was all done by one man. In early 1999, Garavito had passed out drunk over a child's corpse and accidentally set fire to an entire sugarcane field. He burnt himself and left behind a lot of evidence. They soon knew it was him, and they soon found his stash of notes, photographs, trophies, all of it. They caught him after he failed to kill one victim who was helped by other local children, and despite his disguise as a politician of all things, they finally got him in custody. A confession of over 100 murders and DNA did the rest. The beast had been stopped and sentenced to 22 years. Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos is eligible for parole in 2023, this year. Harold Shipman, aka Dr. Death. 200 kills, maybe 250. Shipman was only convicted for murdering 15 people, but the multi-million-pound Shipman inquiry report determines the doctor killed at least 215 people, most of whom were elderly women, but some were much younger. If anyone felt I was passing judgment over the States, South America, or the Soviet Union, if I did so, it was in the knowledge that the worst was of my own nation. It's somewhat anticlimactic after an individual like Garavito. I knew Lewis was what we'd call a bad one, but it was a surprise to get so much information on him. However, this list and the word prolific is about the numbers, and that number is well over 200. 200 syringes, 200 families. At the centre of it was this quiet, mild-mannered individual. True, Shipman had none of the previous depravity, and he killed via injections of morphine. Furthermore, his childhood was largely uneventful. He loved his mother, but she died when he was 17. He watched doctors administer morphine to her, which surely influenced him. He got his qualifications, and besides a secret addiction to pethidine, in which he forged prescriptions for, he seemed normal enough, had a wife and kids. But in the late 90s he forged one victim's will to leave him £360,000, and it all unravelled from there. He'd even forged notes about his latest victim, and they found a box of jewellery in his house. The prevailing theory is he wanted to be caught, but maybe he really thought he was unstoppable. Regardless, A few years later, on the 13th of January 2004, he hung himself in prison. I remember the day. He never talked with mental health professionals, which is a further waste. God complex, covert narcissism, just how sadistic was he? We know Shipman was depressed, but I don't think we'll ever know much else.
If you can stay in the community, receive your treatment in the community, then this all adds to the speed of recovery from the illness.
And so the research portion of the 100 Serial Killer Project is suspended. I absolutely want to go back and collect more information, but I also want to go ahead and see what I can find. Of the 100 cases, there are actually 110 documented perpetrators, and however many lesser accomplices to whom I won't be able to dissect. Let's analyse what we've got.